All right. Hi, everyone. All 63, 64, 65 of you. Welcome to Beyond the Binary, how people of color can and should break the two-party system. This presentation is brought to you by your friends, our organization, More Equitable Democracy, and we work to advance racial equity through electoral systems reform. My name is Heather Villanueva. I'm the Deputy Director of More Equitable Democracy, and I'm joined here today by George Chung, our Executive Director.
Hi, everyone.
And our colleague Carlos is our Communications Director. For the purposes of today, he's our resident historian. He is working on getting into the session right now. So as soon as he's in, he will give us a hello, and you will see his amazing mustache.
Hello.
Is that your Carlos impression? Okay. That's very nice. You're going to need to grow your hair out a lot more. Okay, we are also joined by our policy director, Colin Cole, who's running behind the scenes. He'll be monitoring the chat box for us and just making sure things go smoothly. So I have to, one second, I need to close the green room because it is distracting me. They're still working on getting Carlos in. So anyway.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, as Heather mentioned before, our organization focuses on advancing racial justice through electoral systems reform, and we do that through three areas.
Yes, first we work to advance state-based voting rights protections. So like we have a Voting Rights Act on the federal level, this which expands and protects voting rights for people of color, we also need ones on the state level that A, go farther than the federal feds are willing to go, and B, will stay in place as we see federal voting rights, the Federal Voting Rights Act continue to get gutted. As we know, the Supreme Court is not looking too good for us. So, you know, we need to make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row so we can get what we can.
Right. And second, we focus on telling powerful stories about the struggle and triumphs of racial justice in elections. And more folks are talking about how to ensure our elections work for everyone. So we've been producing a lot of content to make the connection between structural changes and what real representation might actually look and feel like. For instance, we have produced a documentary about electoral reform in East Point, Michigan. And we've been hosting private screenings lately, and more on that later.
Lastly, we work to build capacity, particularly for organizers and organizations led by people of color. And we may win some great reforms, but what good is that going to do if there's no candidates to run, there's no organizations with the ability to come in and immediately register people to vote or mobilize their communities? In Washington State, where most of us live, we actually helped build the Washington Census Alliance, and this organization helped foster organizing and collaboration across communities of color statewide and helped us to have the second best census self-response rate in the nation. Oh. So now we're turning our attention to redistricting to keep the momentum going and really help keep folks' eyes on these systems level reforms.
And we really want to stay in touch with you. We want to get you the articles and websites and other resources that we'll be using or referring to throughout this presentation. So please follow the link in the chat box. Hopefully we can drop that in and drop us your contact information. We'll be sure to send you something out we'll be sending something to everyone who attended and signed in. And we also want to work with community organizations who want to make a real change now. So let us know who you are. Who are you? And at any time in the presentation, please drop a question in the chat box and we'll try to get to it before the end. All right, so is the chat box working?
I believe so. I see Colin talking to people over there.
Excellent. All right. All right, so now before we get into things, let's do a little warm up, okay? A little calisthenics. Okay, so Heather, I know you know all this stuff, but for the purposes of this presentation, channel your more equitable democracy self and describe for me how American elections work. And specifically, I'm thinking about legislative bodies like Congress, state legislatures, city councils, that type of thing.
Okay. Let me get into character. So it's 2008. Finished campaigning for the Dems in Washington State. It was a good year, 2008. We won some things. I'm in my late 20s. Haven't yet traveled to other countries to see how their elections work. The question again?
Oh, right. Tell me about the American electoral system. Just throw out a couple of things that come to mind.
Okay. Candidates run, and whoever gets the most votes wins.
Duh, right? That seems obvious. In these elections, do you need a majority to win?
Yes, maybe. Sometimes.
The answer is it depends. In most places, candidates can win with a plurality, meaning whoever gets the most votes wins, which may or may not be the majority. What else?
Right. Okay, we have primaries, usually partisan primaries, to determine who actually runs in the general election. It usually narrows the field.
Right, for the most part, that is true. Partisan primaries are generally what jurisdictions use. However, some places like Washington and California, where we live in Washington, we have what's called a top two primary. So whoever the top two vote getters are, regardless of their party affiliation, advance to the general election. And yet other places like Louisiana and Georgia, yes, I'm sure we all have Georgia on our mind, they have a runoff after the general election if no candidate gets over 50% in the general election. And then we have like local elections, which are often nonpartisan. Okay, so what else?
Okay, we draw districts every 10 years, and it's based on census data, and that process can be pretty political.
Right again, 3 for 3. You're on roll, Heather. Yes, we use the decennial census first and foremost to determine the distribution of seats in Congress among the states. And that process, which is written in our Constitution, is called
redistricting.
Close. It's called reapportionment.
Okay.
After that, the states use the census data to draw districts for those congressional districts and state legislative districts. That process is called redistricting. So,
right.
Half point.
Got it. Okay. Half point.
And how many candidates are elected per district?
All right. 1, although sometimes 2, but it's like 1 candidate per seat or position usually. So like Washington State, my district has 2 seats in the district, but we choose them one at a time.
Right. So by and large, it's 1 candidate per district or position. There's other states outside of Washington that do that. So let's recap. In the US, our elections for legislative bodies are largely based on plurality voting, not necessarily a majority, in terms of whoever has the most votes wins, with single winner districts or positions, right? And the final question, what is the name of this electoral system?
The election.
I'll give you a hint. The name of the predominant electoral system in the US shares its name with a really sappy ABBA song. Name that tune.
I apologize if it makes you feel bad. Seeing me so tense.
Don't know ABBA that well.
You don't know? Winner takes.
Aha!
There it is.
The winner takes it all.
The winner takes it all. Yes, you win. Our system is in fact called the winner. It's called winner take all. And our continued use of winner take all elections has huge implications for political parties, for communities of color, and for advancing racial equity.
Oh, and Chris, Jordan, and Carla, you got it right. Ding! Points for you. All right, nice. That was pretty enlightening. That was fun, a fun little role play. I am excited to dig into this over the next hour or so. So let's tell folks what they can expect for the rest of our presentation, George.
Right. So we're going to talk about how our current winner-take-all elections and the two-party system are, surprise, inherently racist.
Not surprised, not surprised. Okay, cool. Then we're going to talk about how we mess this system up for our benefit and increase the ability for people of color to actually elect folks who care about us and make sure that our votes actually matter, sometimes even look like us.
That's right. Yep. And then hopefully we will have sparked and inspired some ideas for you to bring this home. But before we do that, I think we should do a little bit more in terms of introductions. Shall we introduce ourselves? I'll start. I met Heather when she worked at the Minority Executive Directors Coalition, which was a nonprofit based in Seattle. From her work, I saw a ton of potential for a very talented organizer who is being underutilized. She went on to work in the state legislature, which was awesome. And fast forward a bit, I got a call from the political director from SEIU 775. They organize home care workers. And he wanted to know if he should hire Heather. Heather had applied for a job. And I thought for a second, and pretty much said, well, you'd be a fool to not hire her, so do it.
Yay. And thankfully, they were not fools. I got to work there for 10 years and work on all my favorite social justice issues, from immigrant rights, LGBTQ rights, anti-poverty, and of course, anti-racism.
Nice. And fast forward a decade later, as I was building more equitable democracy, I saw the potential in bringing Heather on board as our deputy director to further ground our policy wonkiness, which I love, with real organizing and power building. In other words, Wonder Twin powers.
Activate! Oh God, where's my camera? I found it.
And I'll introduce my colleague who I hope will join us as well. I met Carlos when he worked on the SAVE IRV, Carlos, IRV Memphis campaign. He was their comms person and did a terrific job making something that seemed very dry and heavily process oriented into something that was really accessible to voters, particularly Black voters. That campaign won by a large margin, and after the campaign, we got to work together on a project to spread ranked choice voting in the South. It was at this time that I learned more about Carlos's background. True story, his academic background is as an archaeologist.
Yes, and he is also the only member of our team who lives in Tennessee, and the only member of the team who has a sweet mustache, which I'm trying to, that's what that's all about. So he also is the only one with a TikTok account, so make sure to follow him at More Equitable Democracy. Okay, George, it's your turn. You ready?
No.
Don't be shy.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, so as George mentioned, yes, you look very good. Don't worry about it. We met a long time ago when I was a little baby organizer and he was already a full-fledged ED. He had already founded and directed an organization called Equal Rights Washington, which was really key in helping Washington become one of the first states to win marriage equality through the popular vote. Yay!
A law which I personally took advantage of when I married my beautiful mustached husband, Tibor, who is a former dancer for the Hungarian folk ensemble. He put a ring on it.
Put a ring on it. The mustaches everywhere. So after Equal Rights Washington, George ran Washington State Voices affiliate, which was super cool because here was this person of color wrangling all of the state's major political players and political funders on shared projects.
Right. We provided voter file access to civic engagement groups. We coordinated voter contact for ballot initiative campaigns, good stuff like that.
Yeah. And George's superpower is that he's a systems thinker and he's always been really passionate about racial justice. So you put those things together and George just gravitated towards electoral system reforms. In other words, really taking on one of the root causes of racial injustice within our democracy.
I trace that back to my high school geometry teacher, Mr. Hall. He said, you can't play the game if you don't know the rules.
Aha. One of George's also superpowers, George has superpowers. One of his superpowers is making 80s and 90s pop culture references, so you get bonus points if you catch him doing it today.
It's way before my time. I don't know what you're talking about.
I know, you're only 20. Okay, so switch gears now. I actually haven't been working for the past 6 months because I had a baby and I have really awesome parental leave, and I didn't work at all. I didn't even, nothing. Email off, everything. And I was catching up with George one day, because we actually like each other, like his friends. And so he was casually just like, yo, watch this video. It's a little something that our team worked on. And he was like, being all casual about it, but it turns out he actually went and our team went and got NBC to make a video that pretty much perfectly states our thesis. And it's really good framing for our conversation today. So let's take a look.
And as we prep this video, we're actually putting the link for the video in the chat box. So for those who can, we suggest that you actually click on that link to play it because, the streaming video over the platform can be a little bit dicey. So we'll play it, but go ahead and go to the chat and click on this link. It will enhance your viewing pleasure.
All right, here we go.
If we were to wipe the slate clean and to create a system of governance that really centers people of color, particularly Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, what system would really lift up those voices to make sure that those concerns were heard?
The right to vote is a fundamental bedrock of American democracy, and it is a crucial tool in the ongoing battle against systemic racism.
The biggest problems in Metro Atlanta, specifically areas with higher Black populations.
As the primaries have highlighted, race is certainly a factor in our election system. Is this truly a government by the people, for the people? And if not, could a more representative, multi-party democracy help get us there?
The two-party system in the United States, we believe, is a major contributor to structural racism.
George Chung runs More Equitable Democracy, a nonprofit focused on racial equity in elections. He says that our winner-take-all system, dominated by two main parties, has historically underserved communities of color.
Really, there is one party that is just generally hostile to anything related to racial equity and believes, generally speaking, that they have no way to attract more votes of color. So they just pretty much do anything they can to undermine the participation of communities of color. And then the other party pretty much can say, we're here for you, we're not them, we're better, so who else do you have to vote for? And so that creates a really untenable situation where people of color feel like they really have no choice.
Congress is more diverse than ever, yet just over 20% of voting members are racial or ethnic minorities, in a country where about 40% of the population is non-white. The history of the Oval Office speaks for itself. Issues of voting inequities have repeatedly become lawsuits between Democrats and Republicans. In 2018, the Supreme Court held in place Texas voting maps that Democrats argued weakened the growing voting power of minorities. A year later, the court barred challenges to partisan gerrymandering altogether. George argues that a potential solution would be a proportional multi-party system for the U.S. House of Representatives, where instead of a winner-take-all between a Democrat or Republican, candidates from, say, 4 to 5 parties would compete and hold power, the number of seats allocated proportionally to the votes won by each party. This kind of representation would be similar to the systems in Ireland and Australia. Candidates for those parties could also compete for U.S. Senate seats and the White House using ranked choice voting, where voters list out their preference in order, and the winning candidate is determined by rank. These elections would not be proportional, though, since the offices are designed for single winners.
We probably would still have a center-left political party, a Democrats. We would have a center-right political party. I would call them an old school Republican Party that really doesn't exist anymore. We probably would have a Tea Party or other very nationalistic party further to the right, and then maybe 1 or 2 parties further to the left.
Ain't no power like the power of the people, because the power of the people don't stop. Stay what?
I think that this would provide an opportunity for a new party that really truly embraces racial equity as its main value to really rise and really be the home for people of color who just feel disaffected by the two-party system.
Minority political parties have historically existed. but their success in elections is often fleeting. Take the Raza Unida Party in the 1970s, which was comprised of Latinx political leaders in Texas and other southwestern states.
They were able in certain city councils to win all of those seats because they were the majority. But once again, the challenge of a winner-take-all system puts pressure for those small political parties to really try to contest within the structure of the two-party system, as opposed to really blossoming and being able to really embody the hopes and dreams of communities of color because they have a path to building real political power.
There's no constitutional precedent for a two-party system. In fact, it doesn't say anything about political parties at all. George Washington went so far as to speak out against them, but by the time he left office, two parties had formed, and we've operated that way ever since.
If we really think about the challenges that we face in terms of reconciling with our racist history, having an electoral system that is at its core, it's about who sets the agenda and what policies that we pass and govern ourselves. We need to have equity built into that system, because without that, then communities of color and other minority groups will be forever on the outside, and we'll never get to a system that really embraces racial equity and provides real opportunity for all of our communities.
Okay, there you have it. Let's come back to reality. Hello.
Back to life.
Back to life.
To life.
Back to
Back
reality.
to reality.
Very nice. Very good. Okay. So let me just get back into this mode and realize when you did this, we were like in the middle of a pandemic. We were in the beginning of the pandemic. Why, George, does your hair look so good?
It was a wig.
I don't think you can make a wig for
Maybe.
short hair. No. That's
No.
right.
Okay, actually, funny enough, yay! Hooray, yay!
We have Carlos, everybody!
Yeah.
Hello!
Look at his
Oh my
mustache.
God, it's so great to be here with all of you lovely people. Oh my gosh, and 98 people
Wow.
here. That's amazing. That is so great.
I tried to
I
do
hope
an
I'm
impression of
not
your
disrupting
mustache.
the flow too much.
No,
Are
you're
we talking
good.
about this?
I was playing Carlos. Well, back to me and my hair.
Okay, all right, George.
The day I went to get my hair did was actually the first day that the salons were open back up. It was really strange to do this all with my mask on. New normal, yeah. But back to the issue. I want to put out an important idea that, yes, we have struggled for the right to vote, and we are clearly not done, but we also need to lift up the right to representation.
Okay, so let's put a finer point on this. Talk about the difference between the right to vote and the right to representation.
Right. So the right to vote is about the ability to register and to cast a ballot. And originally, the only people who could do so were white men with property. After generations of struggle, the franchise has been expanded to women, to people of color, to younger people who are 18 and older. However, just because you can cast a ballot does not mean you can automatically get representation. Well, what if you lived in a district where your community is 45% of the voters and the other 55% likes different candidates? Well, in fact, they get 100% of the representation.
Okay, so what you're saying is when people of color are the numerical minority, which we often are with some exceptions, obviously, the right to vote doesn't necessarily translate into better representation.
Yes, that's exactly right.
Okay.
It's true that we still have a lot of work to ensure the right to vote. Don't get me wrong, we are not there. But we also need to think deeply about how to transform our system so that communities of color have the right to representation.
Right, that's true. I mean, look at Congress and all of our electoral systems now, even with a more diverse electorate, which is much more diverse than it used to be, we still don't have representative government. Everyone is still hella white. I mean, it's changing. We are getting a lot more representation now, even on the executive levels, but we still got a long, long way to go to get more people of color in office.
That's true, but we also shouldn't. That shouldn't also be the end goal. Skin folk and kinfolk. Just because there are more people of color in office, that does not necessarily mean that they represent the interests of communities of color. In the legal world, they use the term candidate of choice, which may or may not be a person of color.
Right, because we all know like that person, that POC who claims to represent us, but they really don't. And like the other side just like points to them. They're like, they're our token. We're cool. We're not racist.
Problem solved. But before we go into how the two-party system does a disservice to people of color, I think we should ground ourselves in where the two-party system comes from.
Yeah, great. So really, in order to understand where the two-party system has come from, we have to look at the intersection of the history of the Electoral College, slavery, and the winner-take-all system.
Okay, I should have guessed that slavery had something to do with this. Our countryman. Can't get away from
Yeah. Okay, so here we go. Right around 1776, America needed a way to put democracy into action. And what better way to do that than to elect a president? So the framers suggested two strategies. The first was the popular vote. The second was based on a representative framework that would come to take the form of the Electoral College. And both had their merits for a budding democracy, but it didn't really seem to hold much water with the South.
Okay, and so the South, obviously the slave-holding states, why would they not agree to either of those?
Okay, well, philosophically, slave owners hated democracy. But politically, the Southern population at the time was in the millions, but most of those people, or a good chunk of those people, were enslaved Black people who didn't have the right to vote and wouldn't be represented for another 100 years. And so this means that neither the popular vote nor the Electoral College was going to work for them as proposed because...
Right, if the South went along with the popular vote, then they would always be in the minority voting bloc, right?
Yeah, exactly. Just like we were talking about earlier, those minority, numerical minorities, that's the kind of situation that they found themselves in.
Okay, so what about the Electoral College? Why did that not work for them?
Yeah, so the Electoral College, it's based on, the Electoral College size is based on population size. And the South denied Black people, their humanity and their right to citizenship. So again, the South would have been in the minority voting bloc or the numerical minority under the Electoral College. And so the framers made some big concessions to ensure that the slaveholding states would join the Union. And that first compromise was the Electoral College. And the second was the 3/5 compromise.
All right, okay. Let's remind everyone about the 3/5 compromise and why that's significant here.
Okay, so Southern states counted enslaved Black people as 3/5 a person under this compromise. And as a result, slavery-friendly representatives in the U.S. government increased, and the number of electors used in the Electoral College also increased for Southern states. And so Southern states received more than a dozen more electors under this compromise.
Ugh, okay, so the pro-slavery states get more representation based off the population that they were exploiting. Meanwhile, those being exploited are deprived of the right to vote. It's like disgusting by design. Like, okay.
Yeah.
So
bad for democracy.
Bad for democracy. So how does this intersect with the winner-take-all system?
So early in the 19th century, 1800, Thomas Jefferson introduced America to the winner-take-all system as a way to further help elect slavery-friendly politicians.
Jefferson! Ugh, okay. Sorry, tell us more.
Jefferson, a Virginian slave owner, convinced his state to use a winner-take-all electoral system so that he would have a better chance at winning the presidency. And it turns out he was right. Electoral votes were not awarded in proportion to the votes cast. Rather, they were awarded to whoever won the most votes. When the winner-take-all system was implemented, Jefferson won more votes than any other candidate and secured 100% of the electoral votes in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And not only did he take 100% of the electoral votes, he simultaneously erased the votes and voices of those who voted against him.
Wow. Lovely.
Yeah. So Jefferson won the presidency in 1801 with the help of the racist Three-Fifths Compromise and the winner-take-all system, and he served until 1809.
Okay, that is super whack. So why, I mean, like jumping off a bridge, whatever everybody does, what everybody else does, why did other states really like start doing the same thing in political parties? Why were they into this?
Yeah, so by the end of the second term, every other state at the time adopted winner-take-all elections for the Electoral College. Political power really began to be consolidated among political parties. And less than 20 years later, we see pretty clearly that two parties begin to dominate the political arena. Now, those different parties, or different parties at different times, were the top two, but there were always two parties nonetheless.
Okay, so takeaway, it always comes back to slavery, right? This is the original sin of our country.
Yeah, right. And there's also a clear link between slavery, winner-take-all electoral systems, and the rise of the two-party duopoly.
Right. Okay, so now we know that the winner-take-all system has racist roots, and winner-take-all elections essentially perpetuates the two-party system. What happens is that over time, because you're either a winner or loser, there's nothing in between, groups or parties with certain beliefs start to consolidate their ideologies, eventually forming two parties that are, in this case, diametrically opposed to each other, hence the two-party system. And for all you sociology majors out there, I know you're out there because we all love sociology. There's a French academic by the name of Duverger who did extensive research on the connection between winner-take-all elections and the two-party system. And for you nerds out there, we'll drop a link for that.
Duverger.
Duverger.
Okay.
Sounds delicious, doesn't it? With some butter.
Like a
so good.
Put on some cracker. Okay.
Croissant.
Hopefully there's no Duvergers in the chat. Sorry if we insulted you.
Sorry. No, sorry.
Okay. Oh God. Okay. So moving on. Let's dig in. Let's really dig into how this two-party winner-take-all system is really bad for the racial justice, from a racial justice lens.
Right. The first problem with the two-party system, which, remember, is based on winner-take-all elections, is that it relies on segregation to provide meaningful representation for communities of color.
All right, so let's draw this connection between two-party system, winner-take-all elections, and segregation. Go for it.
Right. The thing about winner-take-all elections, as you've stated, is that it gives the majority 100% of the representation. But what about minority groups, particularly people of color? If people of color make up 45% of a district and there's racially polarized voting?
Yeah, that's when white folks vote one way, often for their guy, and POC vote the other way, often for a POC, and it could be anywhere. It really could be anyone who they think is better for the community, but basically white folks voting for white folks, POC voting for POC, or the people they prefer.
Correct. That's racially polarized voting. Folks of color can get completely shut out of power. So in 1965, Congress passed the Federal Voting Rights Act, which basically says that the voting strength of communities of color, read people of color, cannot be unfairly diluted. But given our winner-take-all elections, here we go, can you guess how people of color can achieve some level of representation?
Well, if you can't unfairly dilute our votes, then you have to somehow make people of color the majority.
Exactly. Hence the creation of the so-called majority-minority district. Sounds logical-ish, but there's actually a fatal flaw to this remedy.
Okay, here we go. We're ready for it. Let's hear it.
All right. The creation of these so-called majority-minority districts requires segregation.
Dun, dun, dun. Okay. So, winner-take-all elections make it so that numerical minorities, which are often people of color, can't elect their representatives. So the solution is to create districts where people of color are the majority, but that requires putting all the brown people into one little area, which is racial segregation. And racial segregation, housing discrimination, these are some root causes of racial inequities in health, wealth, education, and on and on and on.
Righto.
Yeah, so it's totally messed up that we have to rely on segregation to get representation.
Yes, that's exactly right. This is a big conundrum. So in certain situations, you see the drawing of these majority Black or Latino districts, many of them in really weird contorted shapes. There's like a earmuff district in the Chicago area that's meant to provide Latino community representation. I call it cartographic gymnastics. I made that up. I trademarked that. Everyone send me royalties. In order for those communities to get to elect a candidate of choice. On the flip side, drawing majority-minority districts for Native Americans or Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders is almost impossible. Our communities are typically too small and less segregated to be afforded this protection under the Voting Rights Act. There's one interesting exception. The city of East Point, which has now adopted proportional representation as a remedy to the Voting Rights Act. So that's been very different. And in fact, we helped produce a video documentary on that, and we will share information on that a little bit later.
Yeah, so the two-party system and segregation worked hand in hand to disempower, or I should say work hand in hand to disempower people of color and communities of color, because it makes it hard, if not impossible, to win real representation by diluting votes from people of color and then having a winner-take-all, loser-gets-none system. So this ensures that people of color are almost always the losers.
Boo. We're not losers. We're not losers. It's not nice to do that. Bullies. Anyway, okay, so all 110 of you who are now on, hi. Welcome if you've just joined us. If you're not disturbed yet, hopefully, or if you weren't disturbed before, hopefully you are disturbed now. Does this make sense to you all? Let's talk about how else the two-party system is bad for communities of color, because I just feel like you haven't said enough, George.
All right, you want more?
More.
All right, more. That's what my baby does, more. The second issue associated with the two-party system is polarization.
Okay, this is when one party takes a position on an issue and the other party is just like, no, I don't like it. I like the other one.
No.
Yeah, this is the case for racial equity in climate change, reproductive health, healthcare writ large, criminal justice reform, immigration, conspiracy theories, the phrase happy holidays,
how dare
face
you,
masks, and the list goes on.
Yes, it does. So given that Republicans have shifted so far to the right and the Democrats have responded by largely shifting to the center, we as advocates for racial equity kind of have to bet the farm on the Democrats as the only party saying anything positive about advancing racial equity. And that doesn't really seem to be a viable long-term strategy.
No, not at all. I mean, they have failed to come through for people of color over and over again, only paying attention to us on election years. And then, even then, it's just like randomly speaking Spanish on the debate stage, right? Like, Dios mío.
No manches.
I love it with that. That leads me to the third issue about the two-party system. I call it capture. Related to the issue of polarization, as there's only one party that's willing to symbolically incorporate racial equity into the agenda, that party believes that no other home, and therefore can be taken for granted. So instead, the party focuses the vast majority of resources on moderate or undecided white voters in suburban and rural areas. there might be some token efforts on GOTV, get out the vote work in these so-called base districts, but that certainly doesn't translate into policy or political influence. So in fact, communities of color really have no choice. They're therefore captured by the Democratic Party.
Okay, so let's talk about the alternative. We don't want to be just like doom, 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 doom. We've already, that's a lot of doom. And right. I'm seeing that people are in fact disturbed. So thank you for giving that feedback. Keep the feedback coming on the chat, by the way. So let's talk. The two-party system is so bad for us, so bad for people of color. What does a multi-party system look like, and how could we achieve that?
All right, so just like Elizabeth Warren has a plan for that, we got a video for that. So while we get that queued up, just a reminder that we'll also drop the link in the chat box over there. So you can watch it on your computer. Streaming seems pretty good. At least the last one was decent. So we'll stream it here, but if you want to watch it on your own computer separately, we can do that. And we'll be back after these messages.
Really, in a lot of ways, discourages participation. Elections for Congress in the United States are based on a plurality winners system where you live in one district, candidates from two or more parties go run in that district, and then whoever gets the most votes wins. Right now, many of our maps are incredibly disproportional. And in a state like North Carolina, Democrats got 47% of the vote, but Republicans have over 2/3 of the seats. Meanwhile, most of us end up living in congressional districts that aren't competitive, where often the opposition party doesn't run a candidate at all. We end up focusing on a handful of swing seats that happen to be narrowly balanced. There's a very strong incentive to vote for one of the two major parties because people don't want to waste their vote by supporting a third party with no chance of winning. When you have 330 million people and two parties trying to represent them, lots of people inevitably are going to feel left out. You have incredible levels now in the United States of dissatisfaction with the political parties. Americans should think more seriously about switching from our current electoral system to one of any number of more proportional alternatives that could solve a lot of problems that exist in American voting today. In a partyless system, it's very simple. Everybody in the state, they would go to the voting booth and they would vote for a party that they like best. And then at the end, we would see how many votes did each party get. And if you got 25 or 30 or 40% of the vote, that's how many seats you would get. And then the seats would be filled by just sort of running down a list that party leaders had made for themselves. Israel, Finland, Norway, Sweden, Germany, and New Zealand all use variations on this system. And as a result, voters have lots of choices when it comes to finding a party that represents their interests. And voter turnout in these countries is much higher than in the United States. Another popular system is called an alternative vote system. You show up and you have to rank a whole bunch of candidates in order of preference. A constituency will elect a whole bunch of different members as individuals, but it's still going to work out that if 40% of people were for Democrats, they'll end up with 40% of the seats. This is how legislators get elected in Australia and Ireland. And there too, you see lots of political parties. In the American system, a loss is a loss. So Republicans don't really put resources into House races in Massachusetts, and Democrats pretty much ignore a place like Alabama. But in a proportional system, both parties would need to fight everywhere. Then they would need to try to engage citizens everywhere. There's no constitutional requirement in the United States that everybody use this district-based system. Most states could adopt elements of a proportional system if they wanted to. Sure, the connection between a specific place and a specific legislator would weaken a bit, but it would also solve the problems of gerrymandered districts and break the two-party hold in our political system. You would get a wider range of views represented, you would get a wider range of talents involved in the system, and you would have more people feeling that they're represented.
Welcome back, everyone.
Just wanted to acknowledge Marisa G's question.
Maria,
we will get to that in terms. I think it's Maria. Is it Marisa? Apologies. But yes, we will get to that in terms of the process and steps that one would need to take to really adopt a different system. So definitely, that's on our mind.
Oh, I see. Marisa.
As the video mentions, no one really wants to support a third party with no chance of winning. We really do need to consider another system. And that other system is called proportional representation. In this video, they use the term alternative vote method. Neither are fancy and are sexy. Maybe we need some workshopping on that. But it would allow for the building of multiple parties and force them to fight for votes everywhere, and not just in those handful of swing districts.
Thank you, George. So now just a reminder, you guys have been doing a great job. Y'all have been doing a great job dropping some comments in the chat. Please also, if you have any questions, we can either try to get to them quickly or get to them at the end. But please do that. And also, yeah, we'd just love to hear your feedback, how you're feeling about this. We see there's 112 people here. Hey, our number keeps growing one by one. So yeah, we're super excited. Now, we have a lot of parties out there, don't we, George? Like the Working Families Party, the Green Party, the Libertarians. I hear there's a Pirate Party. Arr.
Arr.
Arr. Why?
Arr.
Okay, so why can these people like these parties, why can't they like really get a foothold?
They just aren't trying hard enough. No. 2 words, spoiler effect. And many folks, I'm sure, have heard of this concept, right?
Yeah, this is like the Ralph Nader, Al Gore thing.
Right. So just to put a finer point on it, in a typical race, you'll have a Democrat and Republican using plurality winner rules. So let's say in this district that the majority of voters are center-left, with a little bit more than majority. So in this particular race, the Working Families Party decides to contest because the Democratic incumbent is really weak on criminal justice reform, which is the Working Families Party, at least in this area's #1 priority. So after a spirited election, the Working Families Party candidate takes 20% of the vote. The Democrat gets 35% of the vote, which between them is still the majority, 55%, and the Republican wins with 45%. So though the Working Families Party candidate did quite well, it came nowhere close to winning. So some would say that the Working Families Party inadvertently handed the election to the Republican Party, which I'm sure was not the intention of any of those voters.
Right, and we have seen this over and over. It sucks for building the prospects of building a party over long term, and it sucks for voters because we always seem to have to like strategically vote for the candidates that we don't love, or like the lesser of two evils, or the guy that everyone knows because we know him because he was Obama's running mate, but we're really glad that he got elected because he's not a white supremacist chaos-loving agent. And we'd all rather vote for the person we actually like, but our conscience, but sometimes we have to strategically vote in the system.
Right. Maybe the candidates or the parties aren't the spoilers. Maybe the system's spoiled.
Spoiler, it is.
Oh.
And there are better systems.
Yeah. All right. Let's talk about these better systems. Let's do it. Talk to me. Give it to me. We just lost you, George.
Oh no, George, we lost you.
George, how dare you? No, we can't hear you. I'm going to pretend to be George. Hi, my name is George. Some people didn't know that I was an athlete. I was a former athlete. Yeah. I really love musicals a lot.
I was almost what was he? He was a chemist. He was some sort of biological engineer or something.
Alchemist? Is that what you're saying? Alchemist?
Chemist. I think that he almost went into like chemistry rather than electoral reform. Where would we be without George had he decided to start working in a lab somewhere?
Oh, I mean, maybe we would have the cure for the coronavirus now? I don't know.
Probably. He was pretty smart.
He's a genius.
Yeah.
No, we can't hear you still,
we
George.
Still can't hear you, George.
All right. Well, what if I answer my own question? Unless you're ready.
Here, I can answer
No,
it.
you answer the question. No, we can't hear you, George. We don't need you anymore. We're just going to go with Carlos.
Should I put on my glasses?
Yeah,
So I
yeah.
look more
Get
like
your
George?
glasses on. And I'll be you. I'll put my mustache on.
Okay, here we go. All right.
By the way,
Perfect.
the questions that folks are asking, call in our chat boxes, collecting them so that we can try to get to them at the end if we're not getting to them right away. Okay, do your best George impression.
Okay, so within proportional representation, there are variations on a theme. The one that I think George thinks might be best for the purposes of advocacy in the US is a single transferable vote. And it sounds like Stevie Wonder. Oh, and I think that maybe I should put on a pair of sunglasses here.
Oh, my Cherie more, lovely as a summer's day. Okay, it's more about STV.
I'm going to go on. I'm going to move on to STV, explain it a little bit more in depth. So single transferable vote, it stands, well, that's what STV is, the single transferable vote. And it actually has a quite interesting history of implementation in the US, which we'll talk a little bit about later. But it's presently being used in many countries, including Australia and Ireland and several cities in the United States, including East Point, Michigan, which first used it in 2019.
Ooh, I think we have a documentary for that. All right, so
yeah.
This sounds lovely, but it's like a major reform, right? And it would take a lot of time and energy to win a big reform like that. I can hear folks saying, you know, people don't want to talk about changing their voting system. It sounds boring and like something that you could just do farther down the road. Bye, George. We'll see you later. But shouldn't we just focus on the task at hand right now? Like, shouldn't we just focus on driving up voter turnout, target POC voters, getting all registered, include them in our base? Because, you know, shouldn't we just do that? Won't we win? Aren't we winning?
How's that working for everyone?
Ooh, okay. It's not. It's not.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what we have been doing for quite some time, but nothing has changed that much. Not to where we need to be, not to the level where we need to be. We need stronger elected officials who are really accountable to us. Do you honestly think that the Democratic Party is going to take on issues like single-payer health care or reparations for slavery?
No. I mean, if they were going to do it, they would have already done it.
Yeah, even though there's a majority support among Americans for these kinds of really big ticket issues.
Oh, I think I heard something from you, George.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, we can hear you.
Sad, I didn't get to sing my Stevie Wonder song.
And your
no.
Your audio is going in and out. Ooh. Okay. Keep trying, George. Keep trying. Maybe Carlos can tell us a story about history.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to. So as a practical example, let's go back to 1930s New York City.
All right, here we go. Let's go back.
Okay, we're back in time. So a group of New York City residents got together, inspired by the progressive reform movement at the turn of the century, reviewed the laws and election systems in New York City, and recommended that the council adopt proportional representation in lieu of their winner-take-all system. And proportional representation was officially used from 1936 to 1947. And it led to a number of firsts for the Big Apple. For example, Ben Davis was elected as the second Black city council member in 1941 and ran under the banner of the American Communist Party.
Wow, so a communist? we want a communist and a black communist in the 30s. That's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, absolutely. And this was, you know, at a time like 30 years before the Civil Rights Movement. Genevieve Beavers Earle became the first woman elected to the New York City Council. Earle was president of the Brooklyn chapter of the League of Women Voters before her election. Fun fact.
Very cool. Very cool. So sweet. Seems like a big deal that you can actually accomplish all of these things. But why did New York City even do this in the first place? So they're just like, we need more representation. We actually like representation. It doesn't sound like them back then.
Yeah, good question. Before 1936, Tammany Hall, which was a corrupt democratic political machine, the city's use of winner-take-all system enabled them to dominate New York's political system in the city and in the state, often winning 90% of the city council seats with only 2/3 of the vote. And since they used a winner-take-all system, neither the racial demographics nor the diversity of political thought was represented very well.
Okay, so it sounds like it actually works pretty well, right? So we were able to elect a communist, a black communist, a woman, but New York City doesn't still have this in place. What happened?
Well, yeah, it worked really well. In fact, it worked so well that major forces who lost power colluded together to repeal proportional representation. And opponents parroted racist talking points about the dangers of increasing African-American representation on legislative bodies. System as un-American.
Ugh. I think we stalled for a second, but I think what I'm hearing, the opponents were just like, say the same old racist crap they always say, which is not an unfamiliar argument. I'm guessing that the Democrats and the Republicans didn't really like this either.
No, not at all. But yeah, you're absolutely right. The Republicans and the Democratic parties, they joined forces in New York in opposition. Even though the Republicans had more seats under PR than they had before it, the GOP opposed it in part because the American Labor Party garnered 5 spots on the city council, which was 2 more seats than the Republican Party.
Wow, okay, so that's pretty bad because it sounds like the New York City Council was actually starting to get something right.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, to put a finer point on this, in contrast, the New York City School Board used proportional representation in 1970 and continued its usage until Mayor Bloomberg disbanded the whole school board in the 2000s. And during that time, the school board was a very close reflection of the broader electorate.
Okay, so we have a historical example of how proportional representation works to get progressive parties and candidates elected, but wouldn't the opposite be true? So George mentioned this in the first video. It's like Oprah, right? You get a party, you get a party, you get a party. What about white supremacists having their own parties? Isn't that messed up? Like, how do you guarantee that they don't take over?
Well, funny you should ask. If I were an alien coming to visit the U.S., this is where George would do an impersonation of an alien visiting from Mars. He would say, "Take me to your leader." He does it a lot better than me. I would reflect that the U.S. has a centrist party, the Democrats, and a white supremacist party, Republicans. Our winner-take-all system is very susceptible to a faction dominating a major party. With proportional representation, there would be pressure within the Republican Party to separate the hardcore white nationalist faction with the more moderate wing.
Okay, well, this is intriguing, but tell us what this has to do with advancing racial equity.
When thinking about what we as a community need to achieve, what we need in order to achieve representation, we should also think about how we can divide our opposition. If we
Right.
keep going on with the winner-take-all elections, I'm deeply concerned that the Republican Party will stay on the fringe of what should be considered mainstream, and yet will continue to hold governing power.
Yeah, so kind of like how the Tea Party took over Republicans 10 years ago, or some might say AOC and the Squad are pushing Dems farther to the left with like much more limited success. It's like that kind of, but it seems like it's getting even worse. Like, didn't Georgia just elect a QAnon supporter to Congress? I think there's actually 2 that were elected, and they were running as Republicans, so they're just going to keep pulling the GOP farther and farther to the right, and they're just going to keep getting more disconnected from reality, the farther they go.
Yes, and right now we're seeing white supremacists gaining a lot of political legitimacy. So rather than allowing for white supremacy to be a guiding principle of a major party, I would rather see a far right-wing party, one with their own small share of seats, with little chance of actually being in government, calling the shots. Yeah, actually governing.
So by forcing them into their own party, that allows them to be distinct from the larger party and have some lines drawn around them, draw a fence around them, or some might say a wall, although we don't believe in walls. But they would be over there, right? And it would have the effect of marginalizing them as too far or too extreme. I'm really curious to hear what folks are thinking about this idea. We still have 102 of you watching, and thank you so much for bearing with us through all the technical difficulties. But yeah, so what do you think about this? Anyway, so it has the effect of pushing those far right people over to the right. And we're all like, okay, you're extreme, go over there.
Yeah, and research actually shows that it's true that if you isolate the fringe, you can actually organize against it much more easily. So in Iceland, where proportional representation is used, a handful of far-right anti-immigrant extremists elected under their own party banner actually drove up national support for immigrant rights.
Okay, so you have a common enemy to unite around. The enemy has a face. It's ugly. But let's talk about how the two-party system would actually work. I mean, it sounds dreamy, but let's get down to the ticky-tack. What's the actual process? And let's talk a little bit about mechanics. So I'm going to go ahead and share a video that Vox produced. Carlos, you want to take it from here while I cue it up?
Yeah, so this video is really focused on Congress within the two-party system. But try to think about this through the lens of a multi-party system. If you identified with, let's say, the Working Families Party or the Democratic Socialist Party, how would this work for you? And once again, we are going to add a link in the chat box for your viewing pleasure. And we will be back in a few minutes.
All right, here we go.
Most American voters do have a voice in Congress, but it's a lot quieter than it used to be.
The country used to routinely increase the size of the House, and we stopped doing that about a century ago.
In 1793, every 34,000 people got one representative, and Madison thought that number should never pass 50,000. Today, the average district has 750,000 people. That's huge compared to other countries. In the UK, it's 100,000. If we brought our number down and made a few changes, voices that were once silenced would be heard. Let's go back to Pennsylvania. These Republicans and these Democrats have no voice right now. And if you added more representatives, making districts smaller, that would still be true for these voters. But this idea of one representative per district, that's really old. Since America was founded, half the world has become democratic. And these countries invented new ways of doing things. Like, instead of one representative per district, multiple representatives per jumbo district. And they've tried out new ways of voting. Let's say this district has 4 seats, and 7 people are running for them. 4 Republicans, and 3 Democrats. Instead of voters picking one candidate, they could rank them. If this is how many voters picked each candidate as their first choice, the candidates who got past a certain level, say 25%, will get a seat, and any extra votes would go to the voters' second choices. And then the candidates with the fewest votes would get eliminated, and these votes would also get redistributed to second choice candidates. Republicans get 3/4 of the votes and 3/4 of the seats, but Democrats now get a voice too. And with this system, so would the hundreds of thousands of Democrats in deep red Arkansas, and the millions of Republicans in liberal New York City. And gerrymandering would be a lot harder. No matter how the lines are drawn, you get pretty much the same result.
Right, and we're back. George, do we have you back yet?
Am I back?
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
Hey.
You're back. Hello.
Now is your chance if you would like to do your solo performance of Ma Chérie Amour.
My chérie amour, lovely as a summer's day. All right. I'm better now. Thank you.
Back to business.
Beautiful.
Talk to us about this video, George.
All right. Right. So this video talks about proportional representation and its impact on the two parties. And that's all correct. But if you take the argument and apply it to a multi-party system in a state like Washington, where currently Democrats control all of the seats in Western Washington, or King County at least, the Republicans control all the seats in Eastern Washington, and except for some of the larger cities. On the other hand, if we had proportional representation, then in King County we'd get maybe a Republican and some Working Families Party and some Democratic Socialists, and Democrats in Eastern Washington would actually get some real representation. So it would be, in fact, a lot fairer of a system.
Wow, okay, great. So before we move on and talk about, what's next for the audience, we have a special request from folks in the chat who want to hear your alien impression, George.
My what?
Your alien impression.
Oh, take me to your leader. I am from Mars. It's kind of robot meets alien, so I don't have a lot. I'm grasping at straws, but thank you. I appreciate it. I'm
wonderful.
Yeah, that was. Please tell us if that was worth it. It's definitely more robot than alien.
Alien robot. They exist, I think.
Yes. Yeah. AI. Anyway. Okay. Moving on. It is exhausting to me a little bit. I do this work, so I am actually kind of tired thinking about how we actually get to these electoral systems. So if you were an audience member, like where would you suggest that people actually start to get these electoral systems in, new electoral systems in place?
Right. So I think the first thing is to start at home. It's really important for all of us to learn about our local electoral systems. That allows us to understand how we change it. Our local electoral systems are usually baked into a city or county charter, and that's the document that needs to be changed in order to implement a new system. And we can help. We are actually in the process of developing a primer on electoral systems reform and racial equity, which will essentially provide a deeper understanding of how your electoral system stacks up when you think about racial equity. So that resource is coming in the next couple of months. So be on the lookout. The second is to host a screening of our East Point documentary. As we've mentioned a couple of times, East Point has implemented proportional representation for the first time as a remedy under the Federal Voting Rights Act. And so this is a great documentary that really makes it much more accessible to people who want to hear about the human side of things. And third is to partner with us to develop and advocate for a state voting rights act in your state.
Great, thank you. So, all right, let's just revisit what all we've talked about today. So we've learned about why, and of course how, our two-party and electoral systems are racist, like every other old American institution. We've talked about winner takes it all, and loser gets none for people of color. Boo.
Boo.
And Bill, we've talked about we've talked about how we need to move beyond the right to vote and actually fight for representation. And we've talked about how we can actually change the system by moving to a proportional representation system. So it looks like we have some really great questions in the chat. We still have 105, 104. Where'd you go? Why'd you leave? People still hanging in there with us, despite our technical difficulties. So it sounds like this has piqued a little bit of interest. So let me go to a couple of questions we have here. So let's see. Kimberly Haskins is asking about Massachusetts. Massachusetts just had ranked choice voting on the ballot. How does ranked choice voting help if there's still a two-party system? George.
I can take that. So ranked choice voting is what is called a preferential style of voting. Typically, we vote for one candidate, and if that candidate loses, then we've essentially, our vote has been wasted. So ranked choice voting allows you to rank your votes, as the videos have referenced. The reform in Massachusetts was definitely good in terms of moving towards a preferential voting, which gets rid of the spoiler effect, but it didn't really embrace full-blown proportional representation. I think for more equitable democracy, we see using ranked choice voting for single winner races as good, and it is a stepping stone to more dramatic reforms through proportional representation, which is a combination of ranked choice voting and multi-member districts. What was proposed in Massachusetts was ranked choice voting with a single member district.
Great, thank you. And do we know the results of this?
It narrowly was defeated. Okay. So, but on the other hand, New York City voted for ranked choice voting in its single winners form last November in 2019. So that reform will start to be implemented next year.
So they're like slowly going back in time.
Back to the future.
They need to go back a little bit more.
Just a little more. Just a little more. Just go all the way. Don't, go all the way. Not happening.
Yes.
All right. So Jill de la Junta is asking, so with proportional or alternative voting systems, what happens with gerrymandering? Does the issue of gerrymandering go away? George, I'm gonna, nope, Carlos? George.
Yeah, with proportional representation, gerrymandering basically does go away, because no matter how you draw the lines, you're always going to end up with about the results, or I'm sorry, you're going to end up with results that look like the people who voted. So it does away with the need to do either racially gerrymandered districts or political gerrymandered districts. Because like I said, once you remove those barriers and you let people rank their choices in order of preference in a multi-member district, then the people who vote end up being represented.
Another,
just to underscore that, when you only have a single winner, then gerrymandering is all about making sure that that one party or one candidate wins with ideally a very narrow margin. And so you can really manipulate maps to get to that 52, 53, 54% mark. With multi-member districts and ranked choice voting proportional representation, you might be able to determine who's going to be the first place vote getter, but there's no way to determine the second, third, or fourth place vote getter. So in that way, it is insulated. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that we should still have independent redistricting commissions, because taking it out of the hands of elected officials is really important. But those drawing the maps using proportion will have not nearly the same type of determinative outcome that it currently has.
Right, and just one other point on this. So when you are not so limited by the geographics of a district, right? You're not limited by where the line is. People are in larger districts, you can vote for whoever you like, no matter where you live, you get to vote for the person that represents you, right? You get to vote for. You can rank your choice, so you can actually. You're not limited to just voting for the brown person who lives in your district. If you live somewhere else or you live farther away, you're not stuck in that smaller geography that you would have been if you were in a gerrymandered district. Does that make sense? Kind of.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, these communities, whatever kind of community and however you define that, they can live anywhere in the district and still be represented. They can still vote for the candidate of their choice.
Okay, so let us know if we answered that question or if we need a little more clarification. In the meantime, let's go to another question. And please feel free to correct me if I am not pronouncing your name correctly. Isan Bethel. Why do we assume a white supremacist party would be smaller than a general Republican Party? Can we assume that they won't take over, they won't actually govern?
Wow, that's a good point. I think that a far-right party would be smaller than the current Republican Party because there still are lots of moderate Republicans who still vote for the Republican Party. I think that moving to a system of proportional representation would just create the need for coalitions. And I think that there would just be more ability to form coalitions between center right and center left, or particularly center left and the left. I think between the left, center left, and the center right, there is going to be a continued long-term majority, which then in many ways could block a far-right party from being in a governing coalition. But it's a very good question.
Okay, and I think that the correct pronunciation is Ison Bethel. Please let me know how to say it right. I'm sometimes good at reading, sometimes not. So I am committed to saying your name correctly. Crystal Matsona. Ranked choice voting can sometimes lead to frustration because it can be complicated. How do we ensure voters get the representation they want in a ranked choice system? Whoever wants to take that one.
I'll start. I think that any new process will take time. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do voter education to show folks how to translate their preferences into the ballot. But frankly, I think that the research shows that ranking choices for most people is very intuitive. That, you go to 31 flavors. Does that still exist? You go get ice cream, and if your favorite flavor is not available, then you don't turn around and you don't leave. You pick your second or your third choice. So I think that there can be some complications with how ballot design is created, and that might cause some complications. But frankly, that's been a complication for any ballot. So I think that a lot of that is about socialization and voter education, which we all have a stake in.
Someone just said Baskin Robbins.
I would like to kind of follow up on that as well. I think that we have to be very intentional about how we approach this issue of electoral reform. And it's not just electoral reform for the sake of electoral reform. What we're proposing is to create a democracy that is racially just, and that's the first foot that we put forward. And if you can meet people where they're at and to talk about how their issues will be better represented in their legislative government, then people will be willing to invest the time to work through any complicated aspects of the voting process.
Good point.
All right, we have two questions that are somewhat related, so I'll read them both. But George, you're going to have to answer this, at least start to answer it with a robot voice. So please get into character. Kiyohi Kanga, and please let me know if I can correct my pronunciation, says proportional representation is a great idea, but how do we actually implement it Would it require a constitutional amendment, state ballot measures? And then we have Christine Tanga, who says, what do you think should be the step-by-state stages of reforming the electoral system in this country? Any chance of this happening at the federal level, or will this be grassroots, slow, county-by-county effort?
All right. My short answer is I think we should all start local. I think that we should all start locally because it is logical. That's pretty good. I'm here all week. In fact, I'm here all year.
On the fly, yeah.
Not going anywhere. I think that is really important to start locally, and that's why we are really focused on passing state-based voting rights protections, because then being able to dismantle inequitable systems at the local level becomes a lot easier. If you don't have that protection, and currently only a few states have it, it really is looking at how to amend county charters or state constitutions. That's typically the main way you do that. And depending on the rules of how you do that, it can be very complicated. In some places, particularly in the West, you can do citizen-initiated charter amendments or state constitutional amendments. Not every state offers that. And so if the process of a state constitutional amendment needs to begin in the state legislature, that's almost impossible because you're asking people who are most directly impacted by these reforms to change the system on themselves. So I would look at places that you can really focus on changing those systems at the local level first. There was a bit, there's also one piece at the federal level, though it's really hard. In the 1960s, Congress passed a law that requires the use of single-member districts. And so there's been a bill that's been introduced called the Fair Representation Act, which essentially would do away with that ban on multi-member districts and change the redistricting process so that all the states would move to some type of multi-member district system. So if you are doing any federal lobbying, once that bill has been introduced next year, you should definitely talk to your member of Congress about the Fair Representation Act.
Okay, so this is awesome. And there's some really great questions that are coming in now, but we have to wrap up because it's only 3 minutes until the end. I do want to, facilitator's prerogative, take this one, start with this one. Paula Cubiasa says, who are our allies as racial justice, people of color advocates who would also support alternative party systems? And I'll say that we, not just tooting our own horn, we are the leaders in this space when it comes to electoral reform. And, a lot of the folks that are working on electoral reform are, kind of white folks that are just doing it because they want to be more bipartisan or something, or, they just like the mechanics of it, but they're not necessarily focused on the racial justice aspect of it. And we've found that when we go into communities and we go deep down to the grassroots and we talk to people about how these systems work, it's like a no-brainer. I mean, well, it's not always a no-brainer, but people really get it, right? Folks think our communities are not smart enough to understand systems reform, but we absolutely are. So, we can find, it doesn't take that much, it's not that hard to find grassroots communities that can take this and adopt this on their, as something that they support in their own communities. We just need to work on those levels, right? Local is the new place to do all the stuff, right? I was going to do Orange is the New Black. But it's problematic. I don't. Okay. Anyway, I just forget that. This is how this stuff just creeps in. Anyway, so wrapping up, we hope that you learned something new, or at least were entertained by the mustache and the robot alien, some of our singing. We really want to connect with you and get you all the videos and resources that we linked to you today. So please make sure to sign up on our mailing list. Colin's going to drop that link in the chat. And also, don't forget to do your evals. Let us know how we did. Please tell us that we're charming. Because we are, right? Yeah. And I think George has a quick wrap-up story for us.
If you want to hang around for it, I feel like this kind of drove the point home for me. So back in the day, I was involved in the redistricting process about 9 years ago in Washington State. And during this time, I met a guy named Nate Miles.
I remember Nate. Yeah, he was a OG political activist in Washington State.
Right. So he worked for the first Black mayor in the city of Seattle. Norm Rice was a major political supporter of the Democratic Party. We cut our teeth together to get the best maps that we could advocate for folks of color. And so after I moved away, 5 years, came back, started more Equitable Democracy, focusing on proportional representation, I decided, hey, we should at least meet up. I felt like he's probably going to be opposed, Democratic Party guy. So I went through my pitch and I kind of braced myself for like, what the hell are you talking about?
Yeah, he's very much a party guy, Democratic Party guy.
And as I wrapped up, he said, I love it. I was like, what do you mean you love it? I thought that you might react poorly because it might have negative short-term impacts on the Democratic Party. And he quoted, yes, he's a simple person, a former British prime minister. The quote is, "There are no permanent allies or enemies, just permanent interests."
Ooh, nice.
Right. He said, "I want a system whereby all parties and candidates jockey and earn the votes of Black people. And that's the only way that our community is going to move forward."
Dang. Yes. Very good.
Yes. Well said, Nate. Well said.
We are the prettiest girl on the ball. All Democrats, all parties, Republicans too, they can try. They should be coming for our votes, right? Because we are the sexiest. Anyway.
That's right. Time today is coming to an end, and I want to salute you for the audience for spending the last 90 minutes with us today and learning about the connection between racial justice and electoral systems. You're here because you recognize that there is an opportunity to rebuild a more just, ethical, and humane future. I also want to extend an invitation. Join us and join our movement for racial justice through electoral reform. There is no going back. We must embrace a new world where we all have the right to vote and we all have the right to meaningful political representation. Until next time, this is More Equitable Democracy signing off.
Bye.
And for all of you whose questions we didn't get to, make sure you sign up for our mailing list so we can answer your questions. All right, time to go.
Thank you.